Is academia good for the soul? My guess is you all know the answer is yes. No. But do you know why? We know the drill. Academia has been corrupted by generations of scholarship, more focused on tearing down Western civilization than celebrating its triumphs. Are we even allowed to suggest that Western civilization had triumphs? Au contraire. Merely to use the word triumph is to fall into the trap. How dare we claim that Western civilization was founded on anything good, beautiful, or true? How dare we claim that the tradition we value is worth preserving for its beauty, goodness, and truthfulness? Can we even speak of the good, the true, and the beautiful anymore without using air quotes and making abject apologies for speaking in universal terms? It's ridiculous, yet here we are. The purpose of academia has been utterly corrupted, and we are up against the wall with no hope in sight. Our colleagues shame us for making statements about the goodness of God, if he exists, or the truth of the moral law, or the beauty of marriage and the procreation of children. We find ourselves speaking in whispers about grammar and logic, lest we be accused of being white supremacists. We have lost the ability to explain what makes a poem beautiful or how to make a persuasive speech, even as we are surrounded daily by propaganda designed to persuade us to vice. Do you want to talk dirty in the classroom about your sexual desires? No problem. If that is, you don't believe in marriage for the sake of having children. Do you want to talk about what it means to have faith in God? Shame on you, unless you insist that it makes no difference what God people believe in, as long as you believe in evolution by natural selection. Otherwise, you are to be ridiculed and shamed again. How did we get to this state? Culprits are easy to name. It's the feminists. It's the postmodernists. It's the cultural Marxists. It's the Marxists. It's the progressive liberals. It's the liberals. It's the Enlightenment. Oh, wait. Was I not supposed to go there? Aren't we supposed to celebrate the Enlightenment for its ideals of freedom of speech and religious tolerance? Isn't that why we are all here? Well, you see, that's the problem. It is why we are here, but not for the reasons you might think. My personal bête noire is Voltaire, followed closely by Edward Gibbon. You all know what Voltaire said about Christianity, right? Our religion, he wrote to Frederick II, King of Prussia in 1767, is assuredly the most ridiculous, the most absurd, the most bloody religion which has ever infected this world. Your Majesty will do the human race an eternal service by extirpating this infamous superstition. I do not say among the rabble, who are not worthy of being enlightened and who are apt for every yoke. I say among honest people, among men who think, among those who wish to think. My one regret in dying is that I cannot aid you in this noble enterprise, the finest and most respectable which the human mind can point out. Too much? Gibbon was equally scathing in his decline and fall of the Roman Empire with somewhat different emphases. As the happiness of a future life is the great object of religion, of Christianity, not all religions, including ancient paganism, but Gibbon doesn't specify, so religion here stand in for Christianity. We may hear without surprise or scandal that the introduction, or at least the abuse of Christianity, had some influence on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. The clergy successfully preached the doctrines of patience and pusillanimity. The active virtues of society were discouraged, and the last remains of military spirit were buried in the cloister. The bishops from 1800 pulpits, I don't know how he counted, but anyway, inculcated the duty of passive obedience to a lawful and orthodox sovereign. Their frequent assemblies and perpetual correspondence maintained the communion of distant churches, and the benevolent temper of the gospel was strengthened, though confirmed, by the spiritual alliance of the Catholics. Can you parse what Voltaire and Gibbon are saying? It's anti-intellectual to acknowledge Christ. Only the rabble are suited to its yoke. Christianity preaches patience and obedience to the law while enabling networks of communication. Oh dear. Christianity is violent because it buries the military spirit in the cloister. No wonder the enlightened philosophers like Voltaire and Gibbon called for free thinking and freedom of speech. How else could such incoherence find an audience among women, honest women and men? Except, of course, it did up to the present day, where it has become a kind of secular creed. Here it is in one of its most recently celebrated articulations. I will let you guess who the author is. I'll be interested if anybody does. By sanctifying cruelty through focus on the crucifixion, early Christianity set a precedent for more than a millennium of systematic torture in Christian Europe. Institutionalized torture in Christendom was not just an unthinking habit, it had a moral rationale. If you really believe that failing to accept Jesus as one's Savior is a ticket to fiery damnation, then torturing a person until he acknowledges this truth is doing him the biggest favor of his life. Better a few hours now than an eternity later. And silencing him before he can corrupt others or making an example of him to deter the rest is a responsible public health measure. He's being sarcastic there, obviously. Once again, the point of this discussion is not to accuse Christians of endorsing torture. I'm not saying Christianity is responsible for this. Of course, most devout Christians today are thoroughly tolerant and humane people. Even those who thunder from televised pulpits do not call for burning heretics or hoisting Jews on the strappado. The question is why they don't, given that their beliefs imply it would serve the greater good. And do you wonder that Christians in academia have a hard time speaking up? We all know what self-professed secular humanists like Harvard professor of psychology Steven Pinker think of us, however much he protests to the contrary. We all know, we Christians, that simply to affirm our faith in our Lord Jesus Christ as the way, the truth, and the life is to find ourselves lumped with the superstitious rabble whom Voltaire dismissed as unworthy of enlightenment. We all know that with the next breath, Professor Pinker will be claiming, as he does in Enlightenment Now, the Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress, published in 2018, that, quote, it is absurd to seek a foundation for morality in the institutions that brought us the Crusades, the Inquisition, the witch hunts, and the European wars of religion. Professor Pinker is here speaking of both the church and the post-Westphalian European nation-states, the latter of which he rightly points out were not technically medieval, but you get the drift. Enlightenment means closing the door on the Dark Ages with its, quote, starvation, plagues, superstitions, maternal and infant mortality, marauding knight warlords, sadistic torture executions, slavery, witch hunts, and genocidal crusades, conquests, and wars of religion. See Pinker's Better Angels of Our Nature, chapters 3 through 5. That's his summary of what happened in the Dark Ages. Rather, Professor Pinker insists, we should look to, quote, simple, transparent principles that everyone can understand and agree on. Specifically, his words, the ideal of human flourishing. Quote, a viable moral philosophy for a cosmopolitan world cannot be constructed from layers of intricate argumentation or rest on deep metaphysical or religious convictions. History confirms that when diverse cultures have to find common ground, they converge towards humanism, end quote. That is, secular, materialist, atheist humanism, devoid of romantic heroism, not to mention any idea of virtue other than a morality evolved through natural selection. One wonders where Professor Pinker's own academic discipline fits in this secularly grounded morality, given that it was psychologists who were at the forefront of the sexual revolution's celebration of sex as an expression of individual pleasure, unmoored from its biological entailments, i.e. children. To be sure, some psychologists are now beginning to regret this unmooring. Witness the current debates over transgenderism, the ultimate expression of the dissociation of sex from biology. But colleagues like Professor Pinker do not seem to see it as a problem. We in the post-Enlightenment West are more tolerant, more accepting of difference, more open to cultural diversity than any culture ever in the history of humanity. I agree with him there. While at the same time less tolerant of racism, sexism, homophobia, and all other forms of divisiveness, or so Professor Pinker claims. And again, I agree with him on that. We are more tolerant. And how have we achieved this openness, according to Professor Pinker? By acknowledging that human beings do not have the very thing which psychology as a discipline was purportedly invented to study: souls. In Professor Pinker's words, contrary to various misunderstandings, the hard problem of consciousness does not consist in weird physical or paranormal phenomena such as clairvoyance, telepathy, time travel, augury, or action at a distance. It does not call for exotic quantum physics, kitschy energy vibrations, or other new age flim-flam. Most important for the present discussion, it does not implicate an immaterial soul. Nothing that we know about consciousness is inconsistent with the understanding that it depends entirely on neural activity. Our best science tells us that consciousness consists of a global workspace representing our current goals, memories, and surroundings, implemented in synchronized neural firing in frontoparietal circuitry. Whatever we make of the hard problem of consciousness, positing an immaterial soul is no help at all. In a word, we're meat puppets of a puppeteer that does not exist. There are many threats to the academy today. It is easy to name them. Student mobs shouting down professors who try to talk about the long-term social and economic effects of labor mobility, and intelligence-based meritocracy. I'm obviously thinking of Charles Murray. College administrators living in fear of being shamed for not being racially or sexually or theologically diverse enough in their admissions policies. I think we saw a little bit of that in Rick's case. Colleagues harassed and or fired for arguing against the prevailing orthodoxies championed by Professor Pinker as tolerant. But nothing will get you banished from the polite society of academia faster than insisting that perhaps, indeed, a little suffering is good for you, particularly if it affects your eternal soul. You're all very sober. Do you doubt me? Let's try a little test. The Inquisition. You know where I'm going with this. For starters, it had no jurisdiction over Jews. Zero, nada, zilch. What it had was jurisdiction over people who had been baptized as Christians, but whom, for reasons not entirely unrelated to their actual behavior, that was the problem, were suspected of not, in fact, believing in Jesus Christ as Lord. This unbelief could take a variety of forms, but fundamentally it was a rejection of faith in salvation through the incarnation of the Creator of heaven and earth in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. More to the point, it was a rejection of the belief that salvation had been accomplished by God out of love for his creation, as instantiated through the sacraments of the church. What kinds of things tended to make the inquisitors suspicious? In Spain, where the Inquisition was established in 1478 as a function of the state, that's Isabel and Ferdinand and Torquemada and the conversos pleading before the king and queen. In Spain, the Inquisition was established as a function of the state. In fact, it's a state office, which is a little bit of a problem. Typically, in efforts to overthrow the government, which is what Ferdinand and Isabella were worried about. But even then, as an instrument of state, it was better to come before the Inquisition than be handed over to the secular authorities. Inquisitors, see, cared about souls, whereas all the state cared about was keeping the peace. Nor were the inquisitors more likely to resort to torture than the state, quite the reverse. Some statistics may help put things in perspective. The first auto de fe in Toledo took place in February 1486, when 750 men and women from 7 parishes were led through the streets and sentenced to various penances. In August, 27 conversos were burned at the stake. Between 1486 and 1490, 4,850 conversos were reconciled to the church, and 112 were burned at the stake. Respectively, 3.6% and 2.3% of those brought before the inquisitors were executed, while 96.4% and 97.7% were sent home. Of the 44,674 cases, And yes, we know, because the Inquisition kept very good records, of the 44,674 cases brought before the Spanish Inquisition between 1540 and 1700, according to the archives of the Kingdom of Aragon and Castile, only 826 people were executed, which amounts to 1.8% of those brought to trial. All told then, during the entire period, this is Rodney Stark's numbers, between 1480 through 1700, only about 10 deaths per year were meted out by the Inquisition all across Spain, about 4,000 in all. In comparison, between 1530 and 1630, in about 100 years, the English, who are the source of a lot of what we think about the Inquisition, the English averaged 750 hangings a year, many of them for minor thefts, some 75,000 or so. You were better off coming before the Spanish Inquisition. As for torture, the inquisitors, being themselves skeptical of its utility, kept careful records of the cases in which torture was used. Based on these data, Thomas Madden has estimated that the inquisitors resorted to torture in only about 2% of all of the cases that came before them. Moreover, and this is still Stark quoting Thomas Madden, but I'll get to Madden. Moreover, it's widely agreed that prisons operated by the Inquisition were by far the most comfortable and humane in Europe. Instances have been reported of criminals in Spain purposefully blaspheming so as to be transferred to the Inquisition's prisons. In Madden's words, and I do recommend, Thomas Madden's one of our great Catholic scholars. He works on the Crusades, but has also written a number of pieces on the Inquisition. In Madden's words, quote, "The simple fact is that the medieval Inquisition saved uncounted thousands of innocent and even not so innocent people who would otherwise have been roasted by secular lords or mob rule." That's from Crisis Magazine. Nor was it a death sentence to be accused of witchcraft when the Inquisition was enforced. Again, Madden. When the first accusations of witchcraft surfaced in northern Spain, the Inquisition sent people to investigate. That's the point. Inquisitio means to go investigate, right? These trained legal scholars found no believable evidence for witches' sabbaths, black magic, or baby roasting. It was also noted that those confessing to witchcraft had a curious inability to fly through keyholes. You could keep them in prison, right? For this record, the Roman Inquisition also kept the witch craze from infecting Italy. In comparison, in places where the Inquisition was not enforced, you got the trials and the witch craze, right? So they were Protestants. The Monty Python skit, in which the inquisitors threatened the inquisitee with pillows and comfy chairs, is arguably closer to the truth than the fevered fantasies of Edgar Allan Poe in his Pit and the Pendulum. Have I made you uncomfortable yet? You take my point, I hope. It is entirely permissible for Professor Pinker to argue against complaints about political correctness as the dismissible opinions, as he does, of, quote, older and less educated people, mainly white men. The sooner, he says, these aging bigots die off, the better. His word, aging bigots, particularly those who voted for President Trump. In Pinker's words, quote, Trump's success, like that of right-wing populists in other Western countries, is better understood as the mobilization of an aggrieved and shrinking demographic in a polarized political landscape than as the sudden reversal of a century-long movement toward equal rights, end quote. But beware if you argue in favor of the church's concern for people's eternal souls. You are spouting hate speech. You bigot, you and your sky fairy, who wants nothing. I know that's the approved internet term for God, sky fairy. Trust me. You and your sky fairy, who wants nothing more than to see people burn in his imaginary hell. Again, in Professor Pinker's words. Just so you, this is in Better Angels of Our Nature and Enlightenment Now, right? This is from Better Angels. The God of the Old Testament murdered innocents by the millions, commanded the Israelites to commit mass rape and genocide, and prescribed the death penalty for blasphemy, idolatry, homosexuality, adultery, talking back to parents, and working on the Sabbath, while finding nothing particularly wrong with slavery, rape, torture, mutilation, and genocide. All this was par for the course for Bronze and Iron Age civilizations. Today, of course, enlightened believers cherry-pick the human injunctions while allegorizing spin doctoring, or ignoring the vicious ones, and that's just the point. They read the Bible through the lens of Enlightenment humanism. Pace Professor Pinker and his enlightened forebears, but I think we've missed an important step here. If I remember my Bible studies correctly, it wasn't the enlightened secular humanists who insisted that it was wrong to stone a woman to death for adultery, or to punish people for feeding themselves on the Sabbath, or to take up the sword lest you die by it. I hope you got those those references. It is true, as Professor Pinker points out, that early and medieval Christians took the crucifixion as the center of their devotions, but in his vast ignorance of the Christian tradition, he seems to have missed why they did so, particularly during the Dark Ages. If you're curious, I wrote a book about it. It has to do with their emphasis on compassion for Christ and the recognition of themselves as sinners. Professor Pinker and his fellow secular humanists are likewise being likewise disingenuous if they insist that our modern sense of morality is simply an evolved development of civilization. The more civilized we get, the argument goes, the more compassion we show for the poor and the sick, the imprisoned and the outcast, not to mention women and children, in contrast to the God of the Old Testament, who tested Abraham by commanding him to sacrifice his own son. Again, there's a missing step, which I hope is obvious by now. Our Lord Jesus Christ did not tell his disciples that they would be judged for eating lobsters or having tattoos or mixing fiber in their clothes. He told them they would be judged for not recognizing him in their fellow human beings. For I was hungry, and you gave me not to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me not to drink. I was a stranger, and you took me not in. Naked, and you covered me not. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me. Amen, I say to you, as long as you did it not to one of these least, neither did you do it to me. The elephant in the room when we talk about the threat to Western civilization isn't whiteness. It's Christianity, for which whiteness has been deployed as a proxy, including against human beings of races other than white. You know how little people talk about black Christianity in America? This is what the Apostle Paul told the Galatians when certain purported apostles came among them, insisting that to be Christian, they would have to be circumcised and keep the Mosaic law like those who knew themselves to be seeds of Abraham, of the seed of Abraham. No, for you are all the children of God by faith in Jesus, in Christ Jesus. For as many of you as have been baptized in Christ have put on Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you be Christ's, then you are the seed of Abraham, heirs according to the promise. In Christian terms, baptism supersedes not just class and gender, but also, and above all, race. Conversely, it's the denial of the efficacy of baptism that is the origin of genetic racism. This denial was likewise the direct cause of the need for the Spanish Inquisition, to search out those among the conversos who were Christians in faith, albeit Jewish in ancestry, so that they could live among their fellow Christians without suspicion of being Jews. Again, as we have said, the Inquisition had no jurisdiction over Jews who lived openly as Jews, only over those who've been baptized. This conflation of race and gender, our physical identity with religion, is, I would argue, the real basis for the crisis we are experiencing now. Back in February 2017, I wrote an article for the University of Chicago Divinity School Martin Marty Center for the Public Understanding of Religion, in which I argued that the crisis we are experiencing in American higher education is at root not political or economic or social or sexual, although at some level it's all of these things too, but religious. Tellingly, while this piece has received more hits than any other article published on the site, my colleagues in the Divinity School did not include it in their recent compilation volume of Reflections on Religion in Public Life. The single most hit piece in the entire history of that website is not in the book. They did include one of the 7 reflections written in response to my piece. In March 2017, 29 of my colleagues in the Divinity School published an open letter on the Divinity School webpage because they wanted to make clear that, quote, Professor Brown promulgates a view of religion and theology that is not widely represented among the Divinity School's diverse views. Parse that for a second. I know, I'm too diverse for their diversity. In one of the 7 responses, actually I got my slides slightly out of order. So there's 7 responses. Here's the letter, the statement, right? They wrote 7 responses to my blog post, and it's one of those that they put in the book. In one of the 7 responses to my article published at about the same time, one of my own departmental colleagues insisted that, quote, the hateful beliefs advanced by Rachel Fulton Brown are not the values of the history department, but solely her own. Her opinion on race, sex, gender, and faith is both so specious and so odious as not to be worth debating. Exercising my own right of freedom of speech, also as an individual faculty member in the history department, I repudiate her invective in its entirety. What had I said? If you've already read it, then maybe, to be fair. My article had been occasioned by the recent riot at Berkeley, which prevented my friend, Milo Yiannopoulos, from giving the concluding lecture, giving the concluding lectures for his Dangerous Faggot campus tour. But in my own defense, the editor of Sightings had requested the piece specifically as a reflection on what the response to Milo's tour said about religion on American college campuses. I wrote what I was asked to write. What did I see in the response to his tour? The editor knew that I'd been writing about Milo on my personal blog, Fencing Bear at Prayer, specifically the religious imagery that I saw Milo using in his performances, what Professor Jordan Peterson, whom I think you all know, latterly referred to Milo's trickster persona, but which I had argued might be best understood in Christian terms as a holy fool. Well, I'd also compared Milo to the Kung Fu Panda, but somehow it was my comparison of Milo to Christ that got people's backs up. I have no idea why. You all know the story. And this is from that blog post, but I'd like to share. This was my reflection back in the autumn, long before the Berkeley riot, of what I saw going on in Milo's tour. You all know the story. A young man of obscure birth and questionable parentage comes out of the countryside to the big city. He collects a following of other young men and even some women who see him as a good person despite his reputation as a libertine. He speaks plainly and gathers large crowds of simple people who look to him for help and credit him with freeing them from ailments that they'd suffered under for years. He causes a disruption in the city, shames the members of the establishment for their hypocrisy and greed, and bests even the most learned teachers in argument. He violates the most sacred taboos and is accused of blasphemy and corrupting the youth. He's accused by the leaders of his community of fomenting rebellion and of sympathies with the most dangerous elements of the society. Eventually, he's betrayed by one of his own followers, handed over to the authorities for questioning, tortured, mocked, and subjected to a cruel and unusual punishment without proper trial. And yet, even as he hangs dying on the cross, he forgives his persecutors, taking all of the hate and anger and envy and fear that they can throw at him and giving it back as love. No, this is still from the blog post. I am not saying that Milo is literally the Messiah, any more than Poe the Dragon Warrior is meant to be Christ and alter Aslan, as it were, although you have to admit the parallels are riveting. And footnote here became even more so if you know I wrote this post in November 2016, before the riot, before everything. I don't know what my role in this really is. What I am saying, back to the blog post, is that I believe Milo when he says he is Christian, and that as a Christian he strives to model himself on Christ by standing up for the weak and those who are otherwise afraid, given our current intellectual, social, and political climate, to speak things that they actually believe for fear of losing their friends, their jobs, and their personal safety. If not, as in the case of some of our police officers of late, their lives. And then what follows is a list of some of the people that I heard at Milo's talks saying thank you to him for speaking. The women of all ages who would rather not shout their abortions because they see abortion as murder. The young men who have retreated into video games rather than risk being hounded off campus as rapists by women whom they have more or less awkwardly kissed. The working class people, black or white, who see a $15 hour minimum wage not as a guaranteed income, but as an insult to the skilled work they do. As one of my own neighbors, black neighbors, once forcefully put it, you think punching the pictures on a fast food checkout screen is worth $15 an hour? She was outraged, right? It's like the professional women who would willingly accept lower earnings over their lifetime in order to stay home with their children. The women, lesbian or straight, who want to be able to arm themselves against potential attackers. The men, heterosexual or gay, who want to be able to arm themselves so as to protect their families and homes. The Christians, who worry what it means for their national culture no longer to be grounded in the story of sacrifice and love on which they have modeled their lives. This, as I see it, is what our media and establishment elites, the scribes and Pharisees of our day, find so infuriating and perplexing about Milo. He really is, as one journalist describes him, generous, flighty, given to making jokes and poor taste. But he is also, like our Lord, whom he professes to follow, willing to take on the world for the sake of the meek. If in doing so he infuriates the rule makers, those who would insist that it is wrong to pluck corn and eat it, pluck corn to eat, or to reach out in compassion to heal on the Sabbath, all the better. Like the muskox warrior Kai, who's the adversary of Poe, they can rage against him in fury, but he will return their envy with good humor and love. And please read the rest of the post. It's like the Kung Fu Panda was actually one of my strongest inspirations here, because the way Poe defeats the Dragon Warrior is taking all of the hate that the Dragon Warrior throws at him and literally sending it back to him as love. Okay, that's from the blog post. In my sightings article, I argued that the reason my fellow faculty members, as well as their students, were so scared of Milo was because he brought the religious underpinnings of the cultural debate out in the open. I quoted there from a talk that he had given in December 2016 on why the Catholic Church is right about everything, on which I had helped him. And because, thanks to the self-secularization of the American Academy since the late 19th century, they had no practice taking on such theological debates. I thought I was making an argument that, at the very least, my colleagues in the Divinity School would welcome, quote, and this is from the Sightings article, the violent response to Milo's tour of our college campuses, culminating in the riot at Berkeley, is evidence of a deep crisis in religious thinking. If students cannot practice these difficult conversations in school, there is nothing to stop them spilling into the streets, end quote. How wrong I was. My Chicago colleagues, although acknowledging that I had the right as a fellow faculty member to speak, insisted that what I had said put our students in danger precisely because Milo argues from a particular position of faith. In their words, quote, and this was from the letter that the Divinity School signed against me, while the University of Chicago Divinity School welcomes and supports a wide range of political and religious perspectives, the space for disagreement that such a range opens up is undergirded by our shared commitment to create a climate in which the defense of our own perspectives is accompanied by a receptive disposition towards others, end quote. They failed to prove that I don't have that, but never mind. My departmental colleague was less circumspect, and this was Professor Stanley from the previous one of the responses to the sightings piece. Quote, passages in Fulton Brown's piece seem to indicate that she perceives the classroom as a place for conversion of students to Christian religious faith, and the professor as a missionary seeking to advance a religious project. The minds of students should be filled with Christian religion to counter dangerous secular ideas. That false proposition hardly counts as opinion based on scholarly research, end quote. Read, faith in Christ has no place in academia except as a position to be challenged as superstitious and false. Voltaire wins. No thinking man or woman, not even my colleagues in the Divinity School. I am in history, so this was ironic on all sorts of levels, would dare to talk about the incarnation of Christ as the hinge upon which the history of human civilization turns in truth. In other words, as I suggested in my sightings article, there is an orthodoxy to which elite academics are expected to adhere. Multiculturalism. race, class, and gender as the primary analytical markers of being human, the purportedly secular ideals of socialism and Marxism, as in fact my colleagues' responses to my argument bore out. The one point that they made, which I acknowledge is a touch against me, being a fencer, was in answering my claim that universities are the place where we ought to be practicing such difficult debates about faith. They have persuaded me I was wrong. There is no place in the contemporary academy for anything other than the most materialist understanding of what it means to be human, unless, that is, you happen not to be Christian, in which case, I'm guessing here, based on the Divinity School's response, you're allowed to hold your superstitious beliefs in the will of God as long as they don't get in the way of your service of mammon. One of the responses to me was, she's wrong, the university is in fact very corporate. I do grant that, right? Maybe that's part of the problem, right? I definitely missed that. The question is whether it matters that the academy has no place for the soul. I think you know that by now as a Christian, I think it should. More to the point, as a Christian, I think that without a place for the soul, it is evil. Yes, I said that, evil. There are, as Augustine put it, only two choices. Either we live for the sake of the kingdom of God, serving God out of love and gratitude for creating us in his image and likeness, or we live for the sake of the world, serving ourselves for the sake of dominion over each other and over the earth. According to the Academy, however, only one of these choices is real. In Professor Pinker's words, quote, like the phenomenon of physics, the phenomenon of consciousness look exactly as you would expect if the laws of nature applied without regard to human welfare. Read, we're billiard balls subject to gravity and inertia, right? Still Pinker. If we want to enhance that welfare, we have to figure out how to do it ourselves. Read, we will be like gods. I am certain I've heard that somewhere before. The devil loves nothing more than the thought that we believe ourselves to be nothing but puppets of matter, driven by instinct to give into our passions. What do you think contraception is for? That was one of Milo's talks. It was, in fact, the last one that he gave before the riot at Berkeley. It was called No More Dead Babies. That riot at Berkeley that prevented Milo from speaking, what a coincidence that only 2 days before Berkeley he'd given a talk, what turned out to be the last he would give on his tour at Cal Poly, entitled No More Dead Babies, in which he argued more vigorously than even most Catholic priests against abortion. Everything in the modern academy is premised on the conviction that there are no significant differences between women and men, meaning no significance to our existence as sexual beings, any more than there are significant differences between cultures, actually religions, or races, while at the same time we are meant to believe, as Professor Pinker would have it, that there is only one permissible philosophy by which we should live. And he's quite fixed on that, right? There's one. It's the Enlightenment, secular materialist credo that he writes about in his book. Where those of us who argue against this materialist philosophy get it wrong is in thinking we are confronting a new philosophy, whether in its postmodernist, nihilistic, socialist form, or in its classical liberal utilitarian form. The temptations we face are the same ones with which the devil tempted Christ in the desert. Material comfort, you can turn these stones into bread. Social acceptance, the angels will catch you. And dominion over all you survey. All we have to do, or so the tempter insists, is worship him rather than the creator of heaven and earth. Are we so sure that this is a bargain we want to make?
Questions for Rachel?
I will be deeply disappointed if there aren't any.
No questions for Rachel. Stephen.
A very interesting and provocative talk. Thank you. It's particularly interesting because, as you know, Steven Pinker is not loved by the authoritarian left either in university.
I know. Yes, exactly.
And so, And I'm also struck by I'm no expert in Enlightenment, but the idea of the spiritual and scientific magisteria. How you see those separated, because the Enlightenment in some ways push for a strict distinction between those two things. But yet in Canada today, we are being asked to incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing in the classroom, which certainly involves a lot of spiritual or supernatural beliefs. So it seems like there's almost 3 steps here.
Yep. So in the large argument, I say, so on my blog there's arguments about a lot of these things, and one of the strong arguments I've made is that the ideals by which we are in fact trying to live in diversity, inclusion, and equity are Christian ideals fundamentally, right? And in my department there was about the time I was writing all of the Milo posts that year, they were debating a diversity initiative, right? Sort of a diversity inclusion initiative for our own hiring, and I came back on campus and we were debating it in the faculty meeting, and they expected me to be against it, right? They expected me, based on what they thought they knew about Milo and what they thought what Amy said that they thought I said, that I would be against this. And I read it and I said, well, you talk about race and gender, where's class? Right? Why haven't you actually acknowledged that one of the things that we need to be including is diversity of, social economic background, which they put in, but in a kind of interesting way. And then I said, sure, I'll sign it. Do you know why? And the blog post on that one is called The Niceness Cosmopolitan Creed, which is a pun on the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed. That the ideal of diversity inclusion is Pentecost. Right? And I keep saying that grounded in the debates that we're having are fundamental ideals that come out of the deep Christian tradition of Western civilization, including the sense that you do not judge people on the basis of race, class, or gender for their inclusion in the church, right? And to answer to your Indigenous peoples question, that includes the way in which you address people in the process of conversion, right? That you are the post that's up, and I think I showed a screen cap of it last night, the God-ridden bigotry of the globalist monomyth, is answering to Joseph Campbell's monomyth idea that we want to see the same story across all human traditions. Again, that's a Christian missionary position, right? Sorry, whoops. That's a if anybody even gets that joke anymore, that is a practice of hearing the other so as to meet them in their own language. You write dictionaries, translate scriptures, understand their traditions so that you can speak to them from their position first, and then obviously in the missionary context bring them to Christ. But you do that by acknowledging the truth in there. And what we've done is, in the West, take that ideal of hearing other cultures, listening to other cultures, being receptive to other cultures, and forgotten that there was a why to it. And that, I think that's, to me, why we're in this religious crisis. We have no capacity for making any judgment about what's true, right? On what basis will you decide? On what basis can you judge? And that's why I still think it's a fundamentally theological problem. Right now, as a Christian, I'm going to make my argument as a Christian, right? But the basis of what I was saying, and it was wrong of Amy to say I was trying to argue for conversion. I was simply arguing for clarity of the stakes in the debate. And your example is a very good one, that the stakes are our capacity to talk to anybody.
Henry.
Yeah, just a quick historical question. You mentioned the Inquisition did not have rule over Jews, but what led to the expulsion of the Jews in Spain? I thought it was the Inquisition.
She may have specifics, but the Inquisition is established because there's so much tension over the conversos, and the expulsion is saying, we can't sustain this as a state. It was a state decision to expel the Jews, right? The Inquisition, and that's why these two things get conflated by the Protestant black legend, right? And of course, Anglophone scholarship carries that. It's the same reason that we believe that the conquistadores have no concern for the conversion of the native peoples in the Americas, right? Contra to Bartolomé de las Casas's strong arguments in favor of recognizing the humanity of the Aztec and the Incas, even as they're practicing cannibalism and human sacrifice. He's saying that's the most rational position you have. That much of what we struggle with in Anglophone scholarship is the Protestant background of the English. Just think the Spanish Armada and all of the propaganda that has to be in place to make sure that the English know that that Spain was their true enemy. And it plays out in American scholarship similarly in the way in which those institutions are described. So they're ancient enemies that have nothing to do with they're within Christianity, Protestants versus Catholics, but they're more, the great empires of England and Spain bad talking each other. I don't know as much about what the Spanish say about the English, but much of what we have in the Black Legend, including this idea that the Spanish never cared to convert anybody, comes out of that Dutch, but also Dutch and English historiography. So the institution, the history of the institution is complicated by our own perception of it.
So you're saying it was the monarchy that expelled,
the monarchy
rather
that
than the
expels.
Inquisition.
That you were always better off in the Middle Ages being under the church jurisdiction than under the state, because it was the state that did things like expel you. But contrary, it's like the Jews in England, for example, are brought there under the protection of the Norman kings and then expelled by the kings, right? It's the deals that you make with the state are dangerous.
David.
They are. Don't expect this. This is what, as a Christian perspective, say, my kingdom is not of this world. You're going to trust the state? Be careful about that.
So William, and then David, and then Carmen.
Just a point about the conversos, and then a broader comment. I think we could, consult historians. I speak on the authority of our son, who's a historian of the Inquisition. The conversos were not, by and large, voluntary converts. They were faced with a choice of hitting the road or, or converting. Ones who hit the road to Portugal remained Jewish until the Inquisition reached Portugal, and the emergence of a vibrant Jewish community in Amsterdam was a result of the safety of Amsterdam after the defeat of the Spanish. But that's not really what your talk is about. I just want to express...
It was the example of the hard thing, right?
Well, I actually want to express the sense of irony that, of all places, the University of Chicago's condemnation, if you will, of your expression wasn't based on ideas. It wasn't an argument, at least as far as you've disclosed it. It was a moral repudiation, but it was not articulate. It was just, you're wrong and you're bad.
Certainly that's what Amy said.
Yeah, and I would hope for, more articulate. Steven Pinker is at least reasonably articulate. You may agree with him, may disagree with him, but I was surprised by both within the Divinity School and within history, although my secondhand knowledge of history departments is that they're not particularly diverse in their opinion swath either. So that was what was surprising to me from your talk.
So if you look at there's that packet for Rachel Fulton Brown, right, and there's 7 responses. And the response that my colleagues decided to publish in the compilation volume was in fact the only one that had a true substantive response, and it was by one of the graduate students, so that's good. I did a response to the packet. I sat on it for about 2 weeks, and then wrote a lengthy, like 5,000 word answer to the kinds of arguments they'd made. It's called 7 with 1 blow, if you want to look up the post. And what I did was I played it as a fencing bout, because there are 5 touches, and I gave 1 touch against me with that the corporate level of the academy. I recognize that. But otherwise, it was just like, these are not really attacks, right? They're not actually dealing with the argument that I made. They're deflections, or they're pretense, or they're this, that, and the other. And so I went through showing how what you say, I agreed. I was open with my position, arguing as a Christian, but my premise for the academy was, we need to practice these discussions, right? We need to practice having difficult discussions about clearly heated moral questions. And the other thing I told my colleagues when we were talking about our diversity statement was, they're from their perspective talking about, race and gender studies and openness and diversity. They're saying, making a moral argument, and I'm like, you're right. And I'm happy you acknowledge it. I think we are too. It's good that we're actually acknowledging that the study of history is always inevitably moral. And what we have, but what they're doing is sort of saying our moral judgment on these events is fixed, and you're the bigot. And I'm saying, well, there's complexity here, and as good historians, we should be able to investigate that.
I think
Oh.
an argument.
William, let's move on. David.
Thanks for your talk,
Thank you.
Rachel. So the one thing I want to just clarify, it seems that you're saying that it's okay to say Christianity did good things and be able to say that. And I don't think anyone would disagree when you're looking for empirical data. You say, here's the empirical data. But where it gets muddy for me is on the idea of moral questions and then answering the moral questions with non-empirical claims. Only because, so in a divinity school, use metaphysical answers. Yeah, absolutely. But in a history class, how do we use these non-empirical claims? Because my fear is this. I look at, in our university system, where we are now embracing indigenous knowledge. And indigenous knowledge often is non-empirical. And yet, at my university, for example, they are saying we need to incorporate it into every one of our classes. And my problem is, I've been doing my best to make sure that I'm delivering facts. So now I see a gray area. How do we talk about these issues outside of the divinity school, talking and then using non-empirical claims? I don't know how to make that happen. So maybe you could address that.
What's your field?
Well, in this case, I'm a sociologist of religion.
Okay.
So when I'm teaching in that regard, I out myself as a person of faith.
Okay.
I use that term, out myself.
Good.
But I do it as an inoculant for my students so that they know, here's my perspective, which I'm not going to be telling you about the non-empirical stuff. We're only going to talk about the human side. We're only going to talk about the empirical side.
Okay.
Because that's the rules I want everybody else to follow. So how do you
What do I do with
negotiate that?
Okay, so that's perfect, right? Because that is the methodology that I spent the last 10, 15 years trying to develop in order to write the book that I just published. And some of the reason I know about Pinker is to prep for this project, I had a fellowship from the Mellon Foundation. They call it New Directions, right? And the fellowship gave me an opportunity to spend a year studying psychology, and sort of wanting to go somewhere with, that kind of, I guess, scientific or empirical study in order to deal with questions of faith or something like that. And what I came out with after my year in psychology classes back in 2004 was, I'm a historian. And I mean, some of the problems that Pinker keeps doing that. When I say psychology has no place for the soul, I mean it, right? I spent a year in psychology classes and there were no souls there, although psyche is apparently part of the name. Okay, so that wasn't going to work. For me, it's largely a rhetorical problem, but it's also a problem of empathy, right? Okay, I would ask you all to raise your hands who's Christian in this room, but I won't. That I'd say even when I'm talking to Christians, I'm often talking to people that don't know medieval Christianity, right? Or don't really see themselves as Christians in the way in which I'm trying to show them from the Middle Ages. Or if you're not Christian and I'm trying to get you to see what Christians say they see, how am I going to do it? And there's a lot of, I did a course I called Spiritual Exercise History and Text, what do we call it? It's 2006. And we went through a number of different texts like the Bhagavad Gita, the Benedictine Rule, Pilgrim's Progress, some Hasidic poetry, which was really beautiful, some Eastern Orthodox, the Philokalia, and variety of things. And we read the text, and then I try to come up with some kind of analogy for practicing, right? So when we read the Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, they had to do a body exercise of walking and then write a meditation on it. When we did Pilgrim's Progress, we did this mask exercise, which was really intense. I got it from a book on improv theater, right, where you put on this mask, see yourself in a mirror briefly, and then the mask takes over. It's like, talk about indigenous practices, right? It's like there's religious rituals around the world that involve costume, and some of that is what I saw Milo doing, right? It's like you put on this costume and character, the trickster element, to draw out those spiritual truths. So that in the classroom, what we're doing is and I think we do this when we read a great work of literature, right? We're trying to show the students how to read it, get inside that story, imagine yourself into the characters. You can do that with other, non-empirical traditions. You're trying to get them to see the world from that perspective. And as far as I'm concerned, I think that's an appropriate exercise for within the academy, because you're framing it as a particular kind of intellectual investigation. But that you need to do it with particular kinds of sensitivity to the fact that maybe those practices that you're trying to introduce people have real effects. And as a Christian, I might be worried. It's like if you have them take psychedelic drugs and they have this like mind-blowing experience, have you had a mind-blowing spiritual experience, or have you invited the demons in? So in some of the practices I did, I said, I'm not going to have you do this. The example I had in the spiritual exercises was the hesychasts from the Eastern Orthodox tradition, who, by way of this breath control that they do, this is the 14th century, induce the vision of Jesus transfigured on the mountain of Tabor, right? And their critics in the 14th century says, no, that's just you creating this physical response. It's not real. That's where navel gazing comes from, because it was a naval practice. The hesychast said, well, don't do this without proper instruction, because if you are doing it all by yourself and you don't have proper protection and discipline, the demons will get you. So one way or the other, these are dangerous, right? And so you want to, as an academic interested in understanding that element of human experience, understand when analogy works and what practice can show. Obviously, I had a long conversation with Tanya Lerman about this when she was working on her book on the evangelicals. We disagreed in terms of method, right? But I would say it's a lot of that is the kinds of things that I have actually brought into the classroom, which I was sorry my colleague Amy didn't know about, because I had been telling her about them.
Carmen, William, and Joanna are next on the list.
Okay.
Hi there. I'm worried about the way that history, especially the history of Western civilization, is being taught in schools, in academia, etc. It seems to me that it is now the more enlightened or intellectual approach to focus only on the black spots of Western European Christian history, as though that alone, by cherry-picking those alone, it gives a broader picture of the genocidal, colonial, etc. West. And so, of course, the Spanish Inquisition and the Crusades come about, and of course slavery as well. And Steven Pinker, whom I love, you did give a problematic quote there, where in the beginning, where he says something about the God of the Old Testament, who has more of a problem of someone breaking the Sabbath than he does, regarding slavery.
Yeah, that's kind of why Jesus got killed. But
Yeah. Right. But then, what about the history of the abolition of slavery, which is not being taught? This was entirely a Christian movement.
Yes.
Every single one of the abolitionists was Christian, not just Christian by identity, because everybody was Christian at the time, but Christian in argument.
Yes.
William Wilberforce.
Yes.
Used Christian arguments in Parliament, in British Parliament, to end the entire slave trade and to then end slavery itself, and used also Christian arguments to argue for animal rights and for better conditions in factories and better education for children, etc. So we tend to, and of course, Steven Pinker would not admit that part of the Enlightenment was also the Reign of Terror, or at least he would not admit that the Reign of Terror of the French Revolution was also part, an extension of that. Rather, colonialism and slavery and all the evils in the world were an extension of the Christian, colonial, evil, Western civilization. If you try to do some comparison of the great civilizations out there historically and the history of slavery itself, because the Eastern slave trade, for instance, predated the transatlantic slave trade by 700 years and enslaved more people from Africa and even white people from Europe than ever the transatlantic slave trade. But most people don't know that, because we don't teach that in school or in college, because it is more virtuous, it is more enlightened, it is more intellectual to focus only on the evils of the Western colonial civilization, the Christian civilization, than any other civilization that existed throughout history.
Yes. And so I teach at Chicago, we have courses in civilization. They're one of the core requirements that our students have to take. And the course was originally the history of Western civilization. We had a big debate. The last time I was in the media was 2002 when we changed the title, right, to history of European civilization. At that time, I also got described as the enemy when I was in fact the savior, but whatever. That we teach it through primary sources and sort of close reading. So my answer methodologically for teaching is always teach the primary sources, right? You're teaching whatever the period is you're doing. You need to learn how to read those primary sources. But then what I try to do, and as we're reading through this, just one, so that they're practicing that empathy. They're practicing getting into the view of what it is the text is trying to show them. One of the texts we use is Las Casas, either in Defense of the Indians or A Brief History of the Indies. And it's Las Casas's critique of, he's saying in the Brief History, it's written to Charles and Philip saying, "You're king, these atrocities are going on in your name. Why aren't you doing something about it?" And so I show the students that, and I say, "So you all agree with Las Casas, right? What this stuff is happening is terrible." And they're all going, "Oh, yeah, it's horrible." And I'd say, "Why? Why do you agree with him?" And they're like, "Huh? What kind of question is that?" And I'm like, the major thing that we need to start reiterating is the Western Christian tradition's capacity for self-critique, which is how we ended up in this situation in the first place. We care about making sure that the Crusades were a just war, because if not, they're sinful, right? We care, and I do a course on war in the Middle Ages where we talk about just war theory and that problem, right? We care about the fact that slavery was ever a thing because we think it's hateful and awful. We care about whether or not those Jews were forced to convert or not, because in proper Christian understanding, forced conversion is impossible. It's not conversion if you were and Alcuin, back in the Dark Ages, tells Charlemagne that specifically when he wants to conquer the Avars and do it by way of herding them into rivers and saying, confess Christ. And Alcuin saying that doesn't work, right? Our entire education system is premised on argument and persuasion, and that it's very interesting that it's basically the tradition turning on itself is what we're dealing with.
William.
Getting back to the thesis, it's rich that you were condemned for proselytizing for Christianity in the university now when...
I'm glad you noticed.
A huge proportion of instructors now are activists, and I subscribe to James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian's argument that social justice is essentially a religion based on a faith in an invisible force, patriarchy or the oppression of the white supremacist. A church is the protest. I'm just wondering what you think about that analogy and their argument.
It's a heresy. It's a Christian heresy. No, I think that's what it is. I think Marxism is too. I did a post on the I can't remember what it's titled. It's something like the Trinity of the left, right? You said you're in sociology of religion. You know Christian Smith's book on the Sacred Project of American Sociology is, in fact, an even better account of what's going on in the religious element of a lot of the social justice arguments. There's a deep root of it, which is what Smith shows in sociology, which is, again, I mean, it's heretical because it's like part of the good, right? In Christian terms, you're only going to have parts of the good because there's no such thing as evil. It's just corruption of the good. And in sociology, the corruption that Smith shows it's dedicated to the premise that the individual can only flourish if the society is perfected and fixed, right? And so he goes through all of the sociological publications, their journals, and some of their more recent publications showing all of them are making very strong, basically religious claims. And the reason I think our colleagues get so angry with us and upset with us is because we're standing in the way of people's self-realization. How dare you take away their possibility of salvation? It makes us evil. I mean, this is the opposite of what I'd say. We need to get inside their heads. They're not going to do it for us, but we need to get inside their heads and understand why they're so upset. And Smith does a brilliant job, I think, showing, in fact, why. And I use part of his argument at the bottom of the Niceness Cosmopolitan Creed, right? That's what the religious project is, and what we're trying to argue typically as conservatives is that kind of the metaphor I have now that a friend of mine gave me the other day was the differences between if you have difficulties in life, do you put on slippers or do you carpet the world, right? And as conservatives, you think put on slippers, right? Go out in the world. It's not going to conform to your. It's not going to be nice to you in the sense of everything being comfortable. The sociological project, which I think is at the base of a lot of the things that we're fighting in the academy, is you want the world carpeted, right? So nobody gets hurt. That's not going to work because the only way you can carpet the world is totalitarian. And getting people, that's what I was talking about last night, training you to find those slippers, right? So that you put your slippers on and you go out and you can be in the world, again, without being of it. Right? Because otherwise you're going to have a perfect world, and until it's perfect, you're going to be having to fight everybody that doesn't participate in that perfection. I like the slippers argument.
Joanna.
Thank you. I think we could have almost coordinated your question and my question, because I'm going to get onto something similar. As introduction, we have talked about academy being comfortable with dropping moral absolutes and becoming, in fact, also increasingly hostile to the use of logic and facts and arguing the proper practice of argument. And that's why, of course, Pinker is not so loved by many of our progressive colleagues. And yet, in all this, the academy's practices are also very inconsistent with respect to what passes for moral absolutes, because it has been for a while prioritizing a very unbalanced view of human relationship with the environment and with environmentalism. And so it's on the surface based on scientific fact, and yet that fact is very much steeped in a narrative, right? So what do you think about this ongoing turning of a certain kind of environmentalism into a quasi-religious practice? And
another heresy.
Yeah. If you have anything else to add to that, that would be fantastic, but thank you for bringing that in.
Again, I say heresy in a very technical sense, that they're splittings off from what I recognize as the true doctrine, and I hope I'm right about it. Otherwise, I'm a heretic. Everybody's everybody's orthodox to himself, which is always a little bit of the problem, right? That environmentalism, it makes sense in the Western tradition because caring for creation is, again, a Christian response, right? In the Middle Ages, it's Saint Francis singing his canticle to all the creatures, and I'm so glad you asked that, because one of the big themes of my work on devotion to Mary, particularly in the 13th century, is showing the way in which she is described, because she's the place in which God becomes incarnate and present to his creation. She is described through all the creatures of creation, so you can do this great cascade of titles from heaven to earth to rivers to plants to flowers to throne to temple to ark, right? That she's both the natural world and the artifactual world. It's both the creation of God and the creatures that human beings making things in the image and likeness of a maker make as well. So art and nature as part of the thing that, within worship you respond in joy and gratitude to. As far as it's like, animal rights, the environmental movement, all of that comes out of that tradition of recognizing the great value of the world, right? And I had a funny argument once with a colleague who was saying something to me about, species are becoming extinct. And I'm like, well, actually, if you know how many species apparently there have been in the history of the world, most of them are extinct, right? The reason that, and she's like, but isn't it awful? They're becoming extinct, and there's the valuing problem, right? Who cares? We do, right? It's a human valuing on the great mammals, right? Or it's a human valuing on the ideal of the wilderness that develops in the Romantic 19th century. Or it's our perspective in which the environment matters. And you could say, well, that's because I don't know whether the environmentalists are always in favor of humanity, because they say like we're a cancer, an invasive species, right? Which we are, kind of, right? It's like look how we flourish outside of Africa, whereas in Africa there's all the diseases that kill people, right? We're out of our native habitat, apparently, and so the diseases didn't find us yet. It's a human perspective to care, right? And again, so embrace it, right? There's a positive element in their caring, and that's okay, that's good. but turn it around to say, look, but you care because you're looking at it from a human perspective.
My discipline is philosophy, and my goal as a researcher and then as a teacher, my goal as a researcher is try to understand things as they are, for the sake of having that understanding, maybe not to apply it to anything, just to have it, but also because I enjoy the processes of coming to that understanding. So I want to understand things as they are, and what I want as a teacher is to try to help my students to come to be able to investigate things and enjoy the investigation and understand things as they are. Now, I don't see that I need to believe that there's a moral center or to be a person of faith in order to engage in research in this way or in teaching. Philosophy, I think, is agonistic and ludic. Ludic, agonistic. We're disputatious. We throw theses on the board and we say, well, what are the reasons for thinking this is true? What are the reasons for thinking that's false? We don't care whether anybody believes it. And we do it just, our passion is in the enjoyment of the understanding and the enjoyment of doing. Now, is there, from your perspective, then something corrupt about it? Would there be something corrupt about a university that saw itself as a place where intellectuals get together to try to understand things as they are, enjoy the process of trying to understand things as they are, and try to impart the ability to understand things as they are to newcomers?
No, I don't see anything problem with that. I mean, what you're describing is the way I would think of mathematics, right? It's there's an intellectual practice of constructing understanding, constructing proof. Obviously, it's like, I like that you say it's agonistic and ludic, right? You're testing yourself. It's like saying whether or not sports has a morality, right? But I do think you behave morally in the lights of the agon that you engage in philosophically, right? You're not going to cheat in your proofs. So I would find the morality in your commitment to the discipline.
One of my projects as a philosopher is to dispense with the category of the moral.
One of my projects as a Christian is to show you that you are operating within a moral framework.
There we go.
Yeah.
Is there anyone who's not asked a question who wants to ask a question before we end? Phil.
If somebody asked me what my religion was, I'd say I'm a born-again atheist.
Okay.
Or thank God I'm an atheist. But the point being that one can recognize in atheism a certain spiritual vacuum. But one of the most impressive books I read recently was by a secular Jew who became the professor of Jewish studies at Oxford by the name of Gezer Vermes. He's dead now, but he goes through the history of Christianity from the time of Jesus up to the time of the Council of Nicaea.
Okay.
And he basically comes to the conclusion that what evolved in the Council of Nicaea was nothing like what Jesus wanted to teach. And he argues for a new reformation in Christianity. I would say, looking at, for example, Sarah Sanders and some of the other accretions of Christianity that go on in the United States, that he's right.
We have time for. Oh, sorry.
I'm not sure I read my book. Some of what I think is at stake in Christianity is the loss of devotion to Mary, and the sense that I think I would want to know what he thinks is missing in Christianity that isn't in the scriptures, and a lot of what modernists argue is missing is a complete rejection of the entire medieval tradition, which is a totally different exegetical practice. But that's a long argument.
Rachel, I hope we're not tiring you out. Is it okay for one last question?
Sure, one more. That's
okay,
fine.
one last question or comment, and then we'll break. And those who are members of SAFS reconvene in about 10 minutes after we end for the business meeting. And then we'll make our way to Beer Town eventually. But last question.
So I actually want to help address your question. Because what you said was that the indigenous, like let's say medical science or whatever, isn't based in empirical data or facts.
No, I didn't say the indigenous
Okay, sorry. Okay. So it applies to that as well. So what they would argue is we live in Canada under not just a multicultural society, but it's actually based in a theory of multiculturalism. And part of the argument that underpins the theory of multiculturalism is that things that are your culture, that affect your emotions, that is part of reality. So telling someone that their indigenous belief isn't true affects them personally on a sort of psychological level. That's true, that is reality. And therefore, we promote, basically we argue that there are group rights and things like that because they protect the sort of psychological basis of, do you understand what I'm kind of getting at? So even though there's no science that undergirds the indigenous knowledge, there is science that undergirds the idea that by telling individuals that indigenous knowledge isn't true, you're hurting their feelings. It's part of...
I'm not saying whether something is true or not.
Okay.
Well, no, let's turn it over to Rachel. Yeah. Did you want to address that point?
There, I like that. There is a deep religious crisis in the academy, and this is evidence of it. I mean, that's what I was trying to say in the Sightings article, that this is the level at which we need to practice having the discussions. If you want more of my teaching, all of my syllabi are online, and one of the ones I'm teaching this religion and history course, which is a junior colloquium for our undergraduates writing BA essays in history. And the thing we're practicing right now is going through some of these universalizing myths like Campbell and Eliade. We're reading Northrop Frye for Monday. Yeah, and student Protero, God is Not One, and then one that's a fun one for me to finish with Jim Papandreou's book on from Star Trek to Superman, Christ imagery in all of the superhero stories. We need practice at this level of understanding the metaphysical and psychological stakes of exactly what you're describing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.